June 1945. Okinawa. She grabbed my hand in the darkness and whispered four words that should have gotten me court-martialed. Please touch me here. I thought I knew what she meant. I was wrong, and that mistake would save both our lives. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this impossible story began, to a day when the air itself felt like punishment and mercy seemed like a luxury we could no longer afford. The air in Okinawa in late June 1945 was not air. It was a thick, wet blanket woven from pulverized coral dust, the stench of death salt and human misery. The monsoon rains had turned the landscape into a slurry of mud and ash clinging to my boots as I patrolled the perimeter of the civilian internment camp at Tengan. My name is James Sullivan, but everyone called me Jimmy. I was 19 years old from Brooklyn, and I had landed at Hagushi Beach 2 months earlier, thinking of John Wayne and glory. Now I thought of nothing but dry socks and a world that didn't smell like decay. The battle was officially over. General Roy Geiger, who had taken command of the 10th Army after General Buckner's death just days before the island fell, had declared victory. But for me, victory looked a lot like hell, just with more paperwork. My M1 rifle felt heavier each day, less a tool of war and more a glorified stick to herd the dazed skeletal figures that shuffled into the camp by the thousands. I stopped at the wire looking in. The stockade was a sea of gray, ragged kimonos and patched-together rags. The sounds were a constant, low-level symphony of grief, hunger, and terror. U.S. propaganda leaflets had promised humane treatment, but the civilians, particularly the women, had been told a different story by the Imperial Japanese Army. They had been told the blue-eyed devils would rape and butcher them. I had seen the tragic results of that propaganda on the cliffs of Mabuni, where entire families had leapt to their deaths rather than face us. The image of those bodies on the rocks below haunted my sleep. Women clutching infants, old men holding hands with their grandchildren, all choosing death over surrender to monsters that looked like me. My eyes fell on a new arrival, a young woman perhaps my own age being shoved forward in the processing line. Her name, though I would not know it for weeks, was Yuki Shimura. She was not a soldier. She was a student from Shuri, whose world had evaporated in a cloud of naval gunfire and flamethrowers. She clutched a small, tightly wrapped bundle to her chest, protecting it like a drowning person clutches driftwood. Her eyes, wide and black, scanned the American guards with a terror so profound it was almost silent. She was reciting a Buddhist prayer her grandmother had taught her, her lips barely moving. Form is emptiness. Emptiness is form. But the fear was not empty. It was solid, choking her. I watched her. I saw the way she protected that small bundle, as if it were the last anchor in a drowning world. I'd seen GIs do the same with letters from home or a Zippo lighter from a dead buddy. The thought was a small, uncomfortable spark in my exhausted mind. She was doing what we all did, holding on to something, anything that proved we had once been human. Inside the camp's medical tent, Lieutenant Clara Hoffman slammed down a metal clipboard. "We need more lye, we need more DDT, we need more everything." She snapped at a young corpsman who wisely nodded and vanished. Clara was fighting a different war, a war against dysentery, typhus, and septicemia. She was 28 from Minnesota, and she had the kind of tired fury that comes from watching people die of preventable diseases while supply chains moved at the speed of bureaucracy. She opened her diary, a small sweat-stained ledger, and scribbled her handwriting sharp with anger and fatigue. June 26, 1945. Tengan Stockade. We are now responsible for over 15,000 civilians in this sector alone. Admiral Nimitz may be planning the invasion of the mainland, but here on the ground we are drowning in a humanitarian crisis he cannot imagine. The women and children are covered in lice, head lice, body lice. It's a typhus explosion waiting to happen. The order came down from command this morning. Mandatory delousing. We have to shave their heads. Every last one. They will see it as a violation. Another act of barbarism from us. But how do you explain sanitation to someone who believes you are a monster? The processing line moved. Yuki was directed toward a large tent, the sanitation tent. A group of corpsmen and nurses stood outside holding clippers and buckets. A low, terrified wail erupted from the women being pushed inside. The sound cut through the humid air like a blade. I turned my back 50 yards away. I didn't want to see this. I was a soldier, not a barber, not whatever this was. But the sounds reached me anyway. The mechanical growl of sheep shears powered by a coughing generator. The metallic snick of hand clippers finishing the job. The thud of black hair hitting mud mixing with rain. Yuki saw the shears. She saw the pile of black hair on the muddy ground growing larger with each woman processed. The women ahead of her were being held down, their beautiful long hair shorn off in rough, quick strokes. It was a humiliation worse than being naked. In her culture, a woman's hair was her pride, her identity, her connection to her ancestors. To have it taken this way by these giant, hairy foreign men, it was the violation her grandmother had warned her about. She clutched her small bundle tighter. Inside were the last pieces of her world. A folded photograph of her family, a smiling older couple, and a younger boy. A few grains of rice in a silk pouch saved from before the starvation began. And a small, sharp piece of shrapnel she had picked up near her ruined home, a token of the world that had ended. I turned back, drawn by a new pitch in the crying. I saw Yuki resisting not with strength, but with a desperate, frozen stillness. A burly corpsman named Garrett grabbed her arm. I took an involuntary step forward, my boots sucking in the mud. I had orders. I was a guard. I was supposed to be numb to this. But in this ocean of shattered lives, could two people from worlds that were actively trying to annihilate each other see the human being on the other side? Could a Brooklyn kid who'd never left New York until the Marines shipped him out, and a Japanese student who'd been taught that Americans were literal demons, find any common ground in the mud and misery of Okinawa? Yuki's eyes met mine across the distance. It was not a plea. It was a silent, burning question. And as Garrett's hand reached for her hair, I felt the war shift, shrinking from a global conflict to the few agonizing yards of mud that separated me from this girl whose name I didn't even know. Garrett did not see a woman. He saw a vector for disease. He saw task 14B delousing. He grabbed Yuki's shoulder. She flinched, her body going rigid, but she did not scream. The other women wailed around her, a chorus of violation. But Yuki's terror was a vacuum sucking all sound inward. I watched my knuckles white on the stock of my M1. I was rooted to the spot by a complex paralysis, military discipline, profound awkwardness, and a sickening sense of participation. I was the zookeeper watching the handlers shear the animals. "Hold still, sister," Garrett muttered, as if she could understand. He grabbed her hair, a thick black cascade that fell to her waist, oily and matted from weeks in hiding. He wrapped his hand in it and pulled her head back. Yuki's eyes squeezed shut. The steel of the clippers was cold against her scalp. It was not a precise or gentle tool. It was designed to process hundreds of people quickly, efficiently, without sentiment. The sound was a low mechanical growl, and then the zip as the teeth bit into her hair. I looked away, my stomach turning. I focused on a rust-colored stain in the mud. I heard the mechanical buzz continue, then the hand shears finishing the details. When I looked back, it was done. Yuki was on her knees in the mud. Her head, now stubbled and pale, was exposed to the humid air for the first time since she was an infant. She looked alien. She looked like a child. She looked like a skull wrapped in thin skin. Tears streamed silently down her face, cutting clean paths through the grime and DDT powder. She was not crying from the loss of her hair, though that was part of it. She was crying because the last piece of her identity had been taken by a machine operated by men who did not know her name and did not care. She was no longer Yuki Shimura, the student from Shuri, who had once recited poetry and dreamed of teaching. She was a number, a shaved head, a horo, a prisoner. The corpsman roughly dusted her head with white DDT powder. The cloud made her cough and gag. He shoved her toward the next station, already reaching for the next woman in line. As Yuki stumbled forward, still on her knees, the small, precious bundle she had clutched to her chest fell from her grasp. It tumbled into the mud, spilling its contents. The folded photograph landed face up. The grains of rice scattered and disappeared into the filth. And the piece of shrapnel, that jagged memento of destruction, clinked against a rock with a distinct metallic ring. Yuki let out a small, strangled gasp and lunged for it, her hands scrambling in the mud. But Garrett kicked the items away with his boot. "No contraband. Move along." "Hey!" My voice was a croak. I hadn't meant to speak. The word just came out, unbidden, a reflex I couldn't control. Garrett turned annoyed. "What, Brooklyn?" Every guard within 50 yards was watching now. I could feel their eyes. I was breaking protocol. I was making myself visible in a situation where the smart play was to keep your head down and follow orders. But I was already moving forward, my boots leaving deep prints in the mud. I bent down and picked up the items. My gloves smeared more mud on the photograph, but I could still make out the faces. A smiling older couple, their eyes crinkled with joy. A younger boy, maybe 10, holding what looked like a kite. Somebody's family. Somebody's before. I scooped up what rice grains I could find, though most were already lost in the muck. And then I picked up the piece of metal, the shrapnel. It was sharp enough to cut through my glove if I wasn't careful. I looked at it for a moment, this jagged piece of war, and something in my mind noted its thickness, its weight, but the significance didn't register yet. I looked at Garrett. He was staring at me with a mixture of contempt and confusion. "It's just junk," I said, my voice steadier now. "Let her have her junk." I stepped in front of Yuki, who cowered, expecting a blow. That's what she'd been taught to expect from men like me. Violence, cruelty, the fulfillment of every propaganda promise. Instead, I pushed the items, mud and all, back into her hands. I was clumsy. My hands were too big, my movements too abrupt. I couldn't meet her eyes. I just muttered, "Go on, Ike." It was slang we GIs use for all of them, not even real Japanese, just shorthand for enemy. But in that moment, in my awkward, insufficient way, I was trying to say, "You can go. You can keep these things. They're yours." Yuki stared at my gloved hand, then at my face. I was not a blue-eyed devil. My eyes were brown, but that detail didn't matter. I was an American soldier, which meant I was supposed to be a monster. Yet this monster had just returned her treasures. This monster had defied his own kind for junk. She snatched the items and fled into the teeming mass of the stockade, clutching them to her chest, where her hair used to fall. I went back to my post, my heart hammering, feeling the heat of Garrett's glare and the judgmental stares of the other guards. "Brooklyn, you gone soft," one of them called out. "She ain't your sister, she's a Jap." I didn't respond. What could I say? That I'd seen something human in her terror, that watching her lose the last pieces of her dignity had made me feel complicit in something worse than combat. They wouldn't understand. Hell, I barely understood it myself. From her position at the medical tent entrance, Lieutenant Clara Hoffman had witnessed the entire exchange. She made a mental note. Private Sullivan. Returned contraband to prisoner. Captain Hayes observed. She wondered if the young private understood what he'd just done, the line he'd just crossed. Days bled into a week. The routine of the camp became a grim, monotonous rhythm. My patrols became a strange, silent dance. I found myself timing my rounds to pass the section of the camp where Yuki had settled with a small group of other women. I never spoke to her. I couldn't. Fraternization with prisoners was strictly forbidden, and I'd already pushed my luck with the contraband incident. But I watched. I saw her share her meager ration with an older woman whose hands shook too much to hold the tin cup. I saw her meticulously cleaning the mud off the photograph I had retrieved using a torn piece of cloth and precious drops of water. I saw her teaching a younger girl, maybe 14, how to tie a knot in a piece of rope to make a belt for her oversized clothes. And I started leaving things. Small things. Nothing that would be noticed in a supply inventory. A stray can of peaches that fell from a crate near the wire. A bar of soap barely used that I placed on a rock near where the women collected their daily water ration. A chocolate bar carefully wrapped tucked into a gap in the fence. I told myself it was just basic decency. Just trying to balance the scales after the delousing. But I knew it was something more. It was an apology I couldn't speak for a crime I couldn't name. It was an attempt to scrub the image of those clippers from my mind, the sound of her silent tears hitting the mud. I never watched to see if she found the items. I never waited for acknowledgement. I just left them and moved on like a ghost trying to undo a haunting. But the other prisoners noticed, and they wondered, why was this particular guard leaving gifts? What did he want in return? Was this how the Americans softened you before the real barbarism began? An older woman named Keiko Nakamura pulled Yuki aside one evening. "Be careful with that one," she whispered in Japanese. "The kind ones are the most dangerous. They make you trust, and then they take everything." Yuki looked at the can of peaches in her hands, the first fruit she'd tasted in months. She thought about the soldier with the large, clumsy hands who had picked her photograph out of the mud. She didn't know what to think. Her grandmother's warnings echoed in her mind. The propaganda film she'd been forced to watch played on repeat, but the evidence in her hands contradicted everything she'd been taught. Maybe the propaganda lied, she said quietly. Maybe not about everything, but about some things. Keiko shook her head. Don't be foolish, child. They are the enemy. They will always be the enemy. But Yuki wasn't so sure anymore. She had seen something in that soldier's eyes when he handed back her belongings. Not lust, not cruelty, something else. Shame, maybe, or guilt, or just simple human recognition that she was a person, not a thing to be processed. On the seventh day after the delousing, everything changed. The infection that had been growing inside Yuki for 3 weeks since a piece of shrapnel had punctured her abdomen during the naval bombardment of Shuri reached a critical point. The fever made her delirious. The pain made her desperate. And in her delirium and desperation, she was about to do the unthinkable. She was going to approach an enemy soldier in the darkness. She was going to ask him to touch her. And in doing so, she was going to shatter every rule of both their worlds. But that part of the story, the part where everything hung in the balance between life and death, between enemy and human, between the propaganda and the truth that comes next. For now, you need to understand how we got there, how a Brooklyn kid and a student from Shuri ended up in a place where such an impossible request could even be made. The evening of the seventh day was humid and still the air promising another monsoon. I was on late patrol moving through the shadows near the medical tent. The camp was quiet, a few small fires smoking under makeshift lean-tos. Most of the prisoners were already asleep, exhausted from another day of surviving. And then I heard it, a voice barely a whisper cutting through the darkness. Soldier San. I froze, my M1 rifle coming up halfway before my brain caught up with my training. I spun, searching for the source. And there she was, Yuki. Half hidden by a canvas flap, her face pale in the moonlight, her shorn hair giving her the look of a frightened boy. She looked terrified of me and of what she was about to do. Every fiber of her upbringing screamed that this was wrong. A proper Japanese woman did not approach a man, especially not an enemy soldier, especially not alone in the darkness. But the fever burning in her veins and the agony in her side had eroded every rule she'd ever learned. She stepped out from behind the canvas. Her eyes were wide, fever-bright, glassy with pain. She was holding her side, and her breath came in shallow, pained gasps. No, I whispered, motioning frantically for her to get back. You can't be here. Contact was forbidden. A GI seen talking to a prisoner, especially the female one, would be on a barge to the stockade himself, maybe even facing court-martial. But she shook her head, a violent, desperate motion. She took a stumbling step closer. The cultural barrier was a 1,000-foot wall between us. She, a proper Japanese woman raised with rigid rules about interaction with men, was approaching an enemy male. I, an American soldier with strict orders about prisoner contact, was alone with a female internee. Every instinct screamed danger. This had to be a trap, a test, something that would end badly for both of us. Dame, I hissed, using one of the few Japanese words I'd picked up. No, go back. But she wouldn't. She couldn't. She spoke, her voice shaking, using the few English words she had been forced to learn in school back when the world still made sense. Please. She held up one hand, a gesture, a piece of supplication. With the other hand, she pointed to her own abdomen just below her ribs. Please, she said, again her voice breaking. Touch here. And that's where the impossible part begins. In the mud and darkness of Okinawa, 1945, a dying girl asking an enemy soldier to save her life in words that could mean something else entirely. In a world where touch was violence and mercy was a luxury we couldn't afford, what did this desperate plea truly mean? I was about to find out. And the answer would change both of us forever. My blood ran cold. The request was so bizarre, so loaded, so impossible, it stopped my thoughts completely. My mind conditioned by the crude jokes of the barracks, by months of living in an all-male world where women were either pin-up girls or enemies, flashed to a dozen horrifying interpretations. Was this a trick? A test by Captain Hayes to see if I'd violate fraternization rules? Was she trying to seduce me for some reason I couldn't fathom? Or was this something worse, some kind of trap set by resistance fighters still hiding in the ruins? What I said, my voice hard with confusion and fear. Yuki winced, a tear of pure agony leaking from her eye. She saw my frozen, hostile confusion. She saw the suspicion on my face. She thought I didn't understand her English, that the words hadn't translated. Desperate, running out of time, running out of strength, she reached out and grabbed my hand, the one not holding the rifle. Her hand was burning hot, fever hot. The kind of heat that meant infection, that meant the body was fighting something it was losing against. She tried to pull my hand to her own stomach, using what little strength she had left to force my fingers onto the spot. Here she gasped, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. Please, Itai, pain. And then I felt it. Through the thin, ragged cotton of her shift, my fingers brushed against something that shouldn't be there. It wasn't the soft flesh of an abdomen. It was a hard, agonizingly tight mass beneath her skin. Swollen, hot, like a coal buried under layers of tissue radiating heat that had nothing to do with the humid Okinawa night. I ripped my hand back as if I'd been burned, and in that instant understanding flooded through me. This wasn't a solicitation. This wasn't some cultural misunderstanding or trap. This was a medical emergency. This girl was dying, right here, right now. And she'd violated every rule of her culture, risked everything to ask for help from the only person she thought might be able to give it. I looked at her face now, gray with pain, lips taking on a bluish tint even in the moonlight. I saw the truth in her fever-bright eyes. She wasn't asking me to violate her. She was begging me to save her life. Clara. I roared, spinning toward the medical tent. My voice cracked with urgency. Hoffman, get out here now. Lieutenant Clara Hoffman burst out of the medical tent like she'd been launched from a cannon. She had a .45 pistol on her hip and a look of absolute fury on her face. Sullivan, what in God's name do you think you're doing? You want to start a riot? You trying to get yourself court-martialed? You know the rules about contact with prisoners, especially female prisoners, especially at night, when no one can verify what happened or didn't happen. And I swear to God, if you've done something stupid, I will personally write the report that ends your career before you're 20 years old. She stopped. The words died in her throat. Because I was no longer a guard. I was no longer a soldier. I was a terrified 19-year-old kid from Brooklyn, my M1 rifle hanging uselessly at my side, supporting a Japanese girl who was barely conscious, who was slumped against me like a rag doll. I just pointed at her, unable to form words. She's sick, I finally stammered. Real sick. She showed me. Here. Clara's fury evaporated, replaced by the cold, efficient mask of a triage nurse who'd seen too much death and wasn't about to let it claim another victim if she could help it. She knelt in the mud, ignoring the forbidden contact, ignoring protocol, ignoring everything except the patient in front of her. Corpsman, she yelled over her shoulder, not waiting for a reply, knowing someone would come running. Stretcher now. She ran her practiced, gentle fingers over Yuki's abdomen. The moment she touched the spot, Yuki cried out a thin, weak sound that cut through the night like a knife. Clara's fingers probed carefully and methodically. She found the mass, rigid, hot, distended. She looked up at me, her eyes narrow in the dim light spilling from the tent. How long has she been like this? I don't know, I said, feeling stupid and helpless. I just saw her tonight. I didn't know she was sick. Clara's expression said everything about what she thought of my observational skills. Well, you just bought yourself a job, Private First Class Sullivan. Two corpsmen ran up with a canvas stretcher. Help them get her inside. Gently, gently, like she's made of glass, because right now she basically is. The move to the medical tent was a blur of shadows and stifled terror. As we carried Yuki on the stretcher, I saw other prisoners in her hovel watching with wide, dark eyes. They weren't seeing a rescue. They were seeing an abduction. They were seeing exactly what the propaganda had promised. A young woman approached by an American soldier in the darkness, now being carried away to God knows where for God knows what purpose. A whisper passed through the shadows like wind through grass. Was she being taken to be punished for speaking to the guard? Were the Americans finally showing their true nature? The fear spread rippling outward from that moment. We placed her on a cot in the surgery section of the tent, separated from the dysentery ward by a hanging blanket that did nothing to contain the smell. The air was thick with carbolic acid, kerosene, and a faint, sweet, rotting odor that Clara called the enemy. The smell of infection, the smell of flesh dying while the host still lived. Yuki was delirious, her head moving back and forth on the rubber sheet, her lips chanting in Japanese. Fragments of prayers, fragments of her grandmother's warnings, fragments of propaganda, slogans all mixed together in a fever dream that made no distinction between truth and lies. Clara ripped open Yuki's kimono with practiced efficiency. The sight underneath made me recoil, my stomach lurching. The hard mass I'd felt was visible now, a grotesque purplish swelling on her right side, just below the ribs. In the center was a tiny puckered hole no bigger than a pencil eraser, oozing a thin dark fluid that smelled like death concentrated into liquid form. My God, Clara breathed. She grabbed a pair of forceps from her instrument tray. Sullivan, hold her shoulders. She's going to fight. What I said stupidly. What is it? It's shrapnel, Clara said, her voice flat with professional distance. A fragment. Been in there since the shelling. It's walled off, but it's abscessed. She's dying, Sullivan. Right now, from the inside out. The infection is systemic. Another few hours, maybe less, and the septicemia will reach her brain and heart, and then no amount of medicine in the world will save her. Clara probed the wound with the forceps. Yuki screamed a raw animal sound that cut through the tent and probably carried across half the camp. Her body arched off the cot with a strength that seemed impossible for someone so depleted. I grabbed her shoulders, my hands clumsy on her small, bony frame, feeling the heat of the fever radiating through her skin. It's okay, I whispered the words, meaningless, automatic. It's okay, we're helping you. Medical, doctor, daijubu. I was babbling, mixing English in the few Japanese words I knew, trying to build a bridge across a chasm of language and fear with inadequate materials. She was a furnace burning with fever, her skin slick with sweat, her eyes rolling back in her head. I have to open it, Clara said, her voice taking on a grim finality. I have to drain the poison and get that metal out. She looked at her instrument tray, a few scalpels soaking in a tray of alcohol, some sutures, a bottle of ether, a bottle of sulfur powder. This is going to be a butcher shop, Sullivan. This isn't surgery. This is field expedient emergency intervention with inadequate tools and no backup. And if I'm wrong about what's in there, if the fragment has perforated something vital, she's dead anyway. She turned to me, her eyes hard. Hold her. Don't let her move no matter what she does or what you hear. You understand me? No matter what. You're doing it here, I said incredulously. Now in 10 minutes she'll be in septic shock. Clara snapped. In an hour she'll be dead. You got a better idea, Private. You got a fully equipped surgical suite hidden in your footlocker. No. Then hold her and let me work. Clara soaked a wad of gauze with ether and placed it in a cone-shaped metal device. As she brought it toward Yuki's face, Yuki's eyes flew open. She saw the American nurse, the demon in uniform, bringing a mask toward her face. She saw the soldier, the one who had retrieved her photo, holding her down, with hands that suddenly seemed massive and inescapable. This was it. This was the moment the propaganda had promised. The moment when the kindness stopped and the real horror began. She screamed. She thrashed with a sudden violent strength that nearly threw me off. Her small hands clawed at my arms, drawing blood through my uniform. No, Korosaru. No, you'll kill me. Don't kill me. Please, I'll do anything. Just don't kill me. Hold her, damn it, Clara yelled, pressing the mask down over Yuki's nose and mouth. I'm trying. I yelled back, my heart shattering into pieces. I was pinning down a terrified woman while she was being suffocated with a chemical-soaked rag. I was the monster. I was exactly what the propaganda had promised. The kind American who turned vicious the moment he had you helpless. I saw my own sister back home, Marie, fighting off a bee when she was 7, that same wild terror in her eyes. I looked down at Yuki's face, inches from mine, her eyes wide with primal terror of me, of what she believed I was about to do to her. Yuki-san, I said, my voice cracking, tears starting in my own eyes. It's okay. Daijubu, medical, nurse, doctor, Tasukeru. Help. We help you. I was using every Japanese word I knew, throwing them out like lifelines, hoping one would connect, hoping she would understand that this wasn't torture. This was salvation. The fight went out of her as the ether took hold. Her body went limp. Her eyes fluttered closed. The only sound was the generator's cough outside and the frantic pounding of my heart so loud I was sure Clara could hear it. Clara worked fast, her hands a blur of controlled precision. She sliced into the swollen dark flesh with a scalpel. The smell that erupted hit like a physical blow. A wave of putrescence so foul, so concentrated, that I gagged and turned my head, my eyes watering, my throat convulsing. Clara didn't flinch. She'd smelled worse in the dysentery wards. Sponge, she said calmly, like she was asking for sugar in her coffee. Now Sullivan. I grabbed a gauze pad from the tray and handed it to her with shaking hands. She was shoulder deep in the wound now, her fingers probing, searching. It's deep, she muttered. Right up against the peritoneum. If it perforated, if it went through into the abdominal cavity, she's got peritonitis and she's dead in 3 days, no matter what we do. God, she's lucky, or was. There, she said, her voice changing, taking on a note of grim satisfaction. I've got it. There was a wet grating click, the sound of metal scraping against tissue and bone. Clara pulled her arm, tensing, and with a sickening pop that I can still hear it in my nightmares, she extracted a 2-inch jagged triangle of black pitted steel. She dropped it into a metal kidney dish, where it landed with a clang that seemed impossibly loud in the tent. There's your devil, she said, breathing heavily. I stared at the piece of metal in the dish, and in that moment my entire understanding of this war shifted. Because I'd seen enough ordnance in 2 months of combat to recognize what I was looking at. It wasn't the thin, fragile metal of a Japanese grenade or mortar round. It was thick, beveled, high-grade steel with a distinctive pattern of rifling marks along one edge. It was American, part of a 5-inch shell from a U.S. Navy destroyer. Our shell, my shell. The ships that had supported us when we landed. The bombardment that had softened up the Japanese positions before we went in. The guns that we'd cheered as they lit up the night sky with fire. We had done this. We had put this piece of metal into this girl's body. And then we'd captured her, processed her, shaved her head, and if I hadn't broken protocol tonight, we would have let her die from a wound we had inflicted. Clara immediately began irrigating the wound with saline, flushing out the pus and dead tissue, then packing it with sulfur powder. She worked with fierce concentration, her movements economical, wasting no motion. She's not out of the woods, she said without looking up. She's not even in the woods. She's in the ocean. Sullivan, and she's drowning. This infection is systemic. It's in her bloodstream, it's in her lymph nodes. She needs penicillin, a lot of it, multiple doses over several days. She finally looked up at me, her face grim. And I have exactly 1 ampule left. It's reserved for Captain Hayes. The words hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. I looked from Clara's exhausted face to the piece of American shrapnel in the kidney dish, to Yuki's unconscious form on the cot, her chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. She needs the medicine, I said quietly. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, flat, certain. I know Clara snapped her exhaustion, turning to anger, but I can't give it to her. My orders from General Geiger's staff are crystal clear. U.S. personnel first, always. No exceptions. I give this girl the captain's penicillin, and he gets pneumonia. I'm court-martialed. He's dead, and I've violated every protocol that keeps this medical operation functioning. So you're just going to let her die, I said. After this? After we dug our own metal out of her, I don't let anyone do anything. Private First Class, Clara shot back. I'm just one woman with a box of Band-Aids fighting a war against diseases that don't care about politics or protocol. I don't have the supply. The penicillin is locked in the main depot. It's guarded, it's counted. Every single ampule is signed for and tracked. You can't just walk in and take it. I stared at the shrapnel in the kidney dish. I picked it up, feeling its weight in my palm. It was still slightly warm from being inside Yuki's body. I could see the markings etched into the side. U.S. Navy, lot number, year of manufacture. Proof. How far would one soldier go to save an enemy he was supposed to hate? How far would I go to fix a wrong that my own country had committed? There was a moral calculus here, simple and impossible at once. American steel had created the wound. American rules said, let her die. But my American conscience said there had to be another way. You said the main depot, I said, looking up at Clara. Her eyes widened. Sullivan, don't. That's Corporal Kozlowski over there. He counts every single pill, every ampule, every bandage. You'll be caught before you get 10 feet from the lockbox. Kozlowski owes me, I said, my voice taking on a flat, cold tone I'd never heard from myself before. He lost 50 bucks to me in poker last week. He's been avoiding me ever since. I tucked the kidney dish with the shrapnel under my arm. What are you doing with that? Clara asked. A souvenir, I said, walking toward the tent flap. To remind Kozlowski who's paying for the medicine, Sullivan, Clara hissed. If you do this, if you steal military medical supplies, that's not just a court-martial offense. That's prison time. That's Leavenworth. That's your life over before it starts. I stopped at the tent entrance. He looks back at Yuki unconscious on the cot, her life hanging by a thread we'd nearly cut. Then I looked at the shrapnel in my hand. My life's already over if I let her die knowing we did this, I said. At least this way I can live with myself. And I slipped out into the pre-dawn darkness, a man on an impossible mission. I was no longer just a guard. I was a conspirator. I was a thief. And as I moved through the shadows toward the supply depot, I saw a light in the window of the command tent. Captain Robert Hayes was awake, and he was watching. The night was a void, the air saturated with the humid chill that comes before dawn. I moved through the camp like a ghost, every sense heightened, every shadow a potential witness. The small, cold glass ampule that didn't exist yet, that I hadn't stolen yet, already felt like it was burning in my pocket. Every flicker of a distant guard post light felt like a searchlight aimed directly at my soul. I was about to commit a crime. Not just any crime, but theft of U.S. Army property. The most valuable property on this entire godforsaken island. And I was going to give it to an enemy. But she wasn't the enemy anymore, was she? She was a dying 19-year-old girl with a piece of American steel in a kidney dish and a fever that was cooking her brain. She was a human being who had trusted me enough to violate every rule of her culture to ask for help. And I'd be damned if I was going to let her down now. I reached the supply depot, a massive canvas tent that smelled of damp canvas, machine oil, and tin cheese. Inside, lit by a single kerosene lantern, Corporal Eddie Kozlowski was doing inventory. He was a pale man from Ohio who wore wire-rimmed spectacles that were always sliding down his nose. He was meticulous, obsessive, the kind of guy who counted everything twice and wrote it down 3 times. He was also the guy who'd lost $50 to me in a poker game 2 weeks ago when he bet big on a pair of jacks and I'd been holding a full house. Kozlowski, I said, stepping out of the shadows. He yelped, dropping a crate of matches. Jesus Christ, Brooklyn. You scared the life out of me. What do you want? It's 0400. I'm trying to finish this inventory before the supply convoy arrives at 0600. I'm calling in that poker debt, I said, my voice flat. Kozlowski laughed a short, nervous bark. You want smokes? A can of peaches. Come on, Jimmy, I'm busy. I'll get you your money when we get paid. You know how it is. I didn't say anything. I just opened my hand. I didn't show him the ampule I didn't have yet. I showed him the kidney dish from the medical tent. Resting in the congealed dark fluid was the 2-inch piece of American shrapnel, the U.S. Navy markings clearly visible, even in the dim lantern light. Kozlowski's smile vanished. The blood drained from his face. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, he whispered. What the hell is that? It's from a girl, I said quietly. A civilian. Lieutenant Hoffman just dug it out of her. It's septic. The wound is infected. She's dying. Right now, as we speak. So Kozlowski said, but his voice was weak, uncertain. They're all dying, Brooklyn. That's what happens in war. People die. I stepped closer, holding the dish out so he had to look at it, so he couldn't look away. Look at it, Eddie. Really look. What do you see? He looked. I saw the moment recognition hit him. His eyes widened behind his spectacles. That's American, he stammered. U.S. Navy 5-inch shell fragment, I confirmed. We put it in her. Our ships, our guns, our metal. And now she's dying from it, dying from a wound we inflicted. And you're telling me we should just let that happen? Kozlowski stepped back, physically recoiling from the dish. From me, from the moral equation I was forcing him to solve. Are you insane, he hissed. You want me to give you penicillin? That's not medicine, Brooklyn. That's a controlled asset. That's Captain Hayes's personal reserve. That's for General Geiger if he visits the island. It's not for them, his voice cracked on the last word. Them, the enemy, the other, the people we were supposed to hate without question. I shoved the dish closer. Kozlowski flinched. It's ours, I said, my voice low and intense. Look at it. It's a U.S. Navy shell fragment. We put it in her. We did this. Are we just going to let her rot from our own weapon? Is that who we are? This was the moral calculus, the unwritten equation that no training manual covered, no officer briefed us on. When does a human life start to outweigh a military order? When does doing the right thing become more important than following the rules, Eddie? I said, softening my voice. When does a human life start to outweigh a military order? He looked from the shrapnel to my desperate, haunted eyes. He was a man of ledgers, of numbers, of manifests. Everything in his world had a place, a count, a proper procedure. But this was an equation he couldn't balance, a problem with no neat solution. Jimmy, I can't, he whispered, tormented. You don't understand. I signed for every single unit. Every ampule has a number, a tracking code. If I give that to you, we're both in the stockade at Leavenworth before the week is out. They'll call it aiding the enemy. Treason. They could shoot us. You owe me $50, I said quietly. This is the $50, Eddie. Just look the other way, just for 2 minutes. You were doing inventory. You had your back turned. You didn't see anything. That's all I need. 2 minutes. I could see him breaking. See the war inside him between the rules he'd followed his entire military career and the simple human recognition that letting a girl die from a wound we'd inflicted was wrong on a level that transcended orders. His eyes went to the keys on his desk hanging from a hook, the keys to the medical lockbox, the keys to salvation or damnation depending on how you looked at it. Before he could protest, before he could talk himself out of it or into it, I moved. I grabbed the keys and went to the lockbox. My hands were shaking as I unlocked it. Inside, packed in cotton batting like precious jewels, were 6 ampules of penicillin, the miracle drug, the difference between life and death for anyone with a systemic infection. I took one, just one. My hand closed around it, feeling its cool weight, its fragile glass body that contained liquid hope. Behind me, Kozlowski was breathing hard, his hand over his mouth. You were never here, he said, his voice shaking. I never saw you. I was doing inventory. I had my back turned. Your debt is paid, Brooklyn. $50 even. Now get the hell out of my depot before I change my mind and we both end up in front of a firing squad. I ran. I didn't just walk. I ran, my boots sucking at the mud, splashing through puddles, the tiny glass vial clutched in my fist like it was the most precious thing in the world. Because right now, for Yuki Shimura, it was. I passed the command tent. The flap was open, and standing in the opening backlit by a kerosene lamp was Captain Robert Hayes. He was holding a tin mug of coffee, and he was watching me run from the supply depot toward the medical tent. He didn't move. He didn't shout. He didn't raise the alarm. He just stood there, watching, his face unreadable in the shadows. The silence was louder than any accusation. The fact that he was letting me run, letting me complete this theft, this violation of every regulation, was somehow more terrifying than if he'd stopped me. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. I had the medicine, and Yuki was dying, and nothing else mattered. I burst back into the medical tent. Yuki was convulsing her head, snapping back and forth, a thin, rattling foam forming at the corners of her mouth. Clara was bathing her forehead with a wet cloth, her face a mask of grim defeat. She's crashing, Clara said without looking up. The septicemia is in her brain. We're losing her, Sullivan. I'm sorry, I did everything I could, but without the penicillin, there's nothing more I can do. I grabbed Clara's arm, my fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. I shoved the ampule into her hand. You're not losing her. Clara looked at the vial in her hand. Her eyes went wide with a mixture of terror and awe. How she breathed. Where did you, Jimmy? What did you do? Just use it, I said, my voice rough. Use it now, please. Clara looked at me for a long moment, and then she made her choice. She crossed her own moral event horizon. She became a co-conspirator in my crime, because she was a nurse first, a soldier second. And she had medicine and she had a patient, and the rest, as she would write in her diary later, was just noise. She snapped the ampule with practiced efficiency, drew the precious pale gold liquid into a syringe, found a vein in Yuki's thin, dehydrated arm. The needle went in. Clara pushed the plunger, sending the life's work of Alexander Fleming, the miracle of modern medicine, into the bloodstream of an enemy girl on a forgotten island at the edge of the world. "It's in," Clara whispered, her hands shaking for the first time all night. "Now we pray." She looked up at me, and I saw fear in her eyes. Real fear. "And you, Private First Class Sullivan, had better start praying for yourself too. Because Captain Hayes was watching you, and you just committed a court-martial offense, possibly treason. And I just helped you do it." Before I could answer, before I could process what I'd done and what was coming, the tent flap was ripped open. Captain Robert Hayes stood there silhouetted against the lightning sky of dawn. He wasn't enraged, he was calm, which was infinitely more terrifying. His eyes took in the scene with the practiced assessment of a career officer. Clara with the empty syringe still in her hand. Me standing over the cot like a guilty sentinel. Yuki on the cot, sweating profusely as the fever began its first tentative retreat. His gaze fell on the metal tray beside the cot. He saw the empty ampule, the broken glass, the tracking number still visible. And next to it he saw the jagged piece of American shrapnel in the kidney dish, the U.S. Navy markings clear as day. He walked slowly into the tent. He didn't look at me. He looked at Yuki. He watched her for a long, silent moment, this enemy civilian who just received the last dose of penicillin on the island. Then he picked up the piece of shrapnel, weighed it in his hand, looked at the U.S. Navy markings etched into its surface, turned it over, examining it from every angle like it was a piece of evidence in a trial, which I suppose it was. "A complication," he said quietly, setting the metal back down with a soft click. My heart was hammering so hard, I thought it might break through my ribs. This was it. This was the end of everything. Court-martial, prison, dishonorable discharge. My mother's face when they told her what I'd done. Captain Hayes turned to Clara. "Nurse Hoffman, I've developed a rather persistent cough. I believe I was scheduled for a dose of penicillin this morning." Clara's face went white. "Sir, there was an emergency, a critical patient. I made a decision." "I see that," Hayes said, glancing at Yuki again. His voice was neutral, giving nothing away. Then he said the words that saved my life. "I don't need the medicine, nurse. My cough seems to have cleared up. Miraculous recovery. The Okinawa air must agree with me." I felt a rush of relief so profound my knees almost buckled. But Captain Hayes wasn't finished. He turned to me and his eyes were hard as steel. "However, Private Sullivan," he said, his voice taking on an edge, "Corporal Kozlowski's inventory is now incorrect, a serious breach of protocol. And you, Private, were seen approximately 50 yards off your patrol route in a restricted area engaging in unauthorized contact with a female internee." The relief vanished, replaced by cold dread. This was a different charge. Not theft, fraternization, which carried its own severe penalties. "You will report to my tent at 0600 hours, Hayes continued. 1 hour from now, you will bring your M1 rifle cleaned and inspected. And you will explain to me in detail what exactly you think you're doing playing savior to the enemy while we are still at war with their country." He turned and walked to the tent entrance, paused, looked back at the shrapnel one more time. 1 hour, Sullivan. Don't be late." And then he was gone, leaving me standing in the medical tent with a dying girl who might live in a career that was almost certainly dead. Clara checked Yuki's pulse, put her hand on Yuki's forehead. A small, exhausted smile touched her lips. "It's working," she whispered. "The fever's breaking. Her pulse is stronger. You saved her, Jimmy." I stared at the tent flap where Captain Hayes had disappeared. I'd won the battle for Yuki Shimura's life, but I just walked into an entirely new war, and I was completely unarmed. The question is, would Captain Hayes destroy me for breaking the rules? Or had I just accidentally done something that aligned with a mission I didn't yet understand? In 1 hour, I'd find out. And the piece of American shrapnel sitting in that kidney dish would be the evidence that decided my fate. The gray, humid light of 0600 filtered into Captain Robert Hayes's command tent, illuminating a world of canvas walls, stacked ammunition crates, and the accumulated paperwork of occupation. I stood at rigid, terrified attention, my M1 rifle, which I had obsessively cleaned for the past 45 minutes, held at my side. My uniform was still damp with Yuki's fever sweat. I smelled of mud, fear, and carbolic acid. Captain Hayes was not at his desk. He stood with his back to me, looking at a large map of Okinawa pinned to a wooden board. A tin mug of coffee steamed in his hand. The tent was silent except for the rhythmic drip of condensation from the canvas roof and the distant sound of the camp waking up. On the desk between a field radio and a Colt 45 pistol sat the kidney dish. Inside it, the piece of American shrapnel caught the morning light. "You know the Uniform Code of Military Justice?" Private Hayes asked without turning around. His voice was calm, conversational, even which made it more frightening than if he'd been yelling. "Sir." "Yes, sir," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "You know the penalty for willful theft of medical supplies in a combat zone, sir?" "Yes, sir." "And for fraternization with an enemy internee?" Hayes continued, finally turning to face me. "Which is what this is, Sullivan. Don't fool yourself. That girl approached you. You made physical contact. You then committed theft to provide her with medical treatment reserved for American personnel. In the eyes of military law, that's fraternization. That's aiding the enemy. That's a general court-martial, possibly a firing squad if they want to make an example." My blood ran cold. I had known it was serious, but hearing it laid out like that, hearing the word firing squad spoken in this quiet tent on this quiet morning made it real in a way it hadn't been before. Hayes was a man in his 40s with lines of exhaustion etched so deep into his face they looked like scars. He wasn't angry. He was calculating, measuring, deciding something. "You think you're a hero, Private?" he asked, stepping toward me. "You think you just saved a life, and that makes you noble? That makes you better than the rest of us who follow all orders?" "No, sir," I stammered. I couldn't let her die. Not from that, not from our own shrapnel." Hayes stopped 2 feet in front of me. His eyes bored into mine. "You just compromised my command, Sullivan. You put Lieutenant Hoffman in an impossible position. You corrupted Corporal Kozlowski. You stole from your fellow soldiers. Men who might need that penicillin. Men who earned it by serving their country. And you gave it to the enemy." The words hit like physical blows. Each one was true. Each one was damning. "Sir, it was me," I said desperately. "I forced Kozlowski. I stole it. Lieutenant Hoffman just did her job as a nurse when a patient was brought to her. They shouldn't be punished for what I did." Quiet Hayes snapped. I snapped my jaw shut so hard my teeth clicked together. Hayes stared at me for a long moment. Then he walked to the desk and picked up the piece of shrapnel, held it up between us, turning it so the U.S. Navy markings caught the light. "Do you have any idea what we are doing here, Sullivan? Do you think this is about winning a battle? The battle is over. Okinawa is ours. This," he waved his hand at the camp beyond the tent flap, "is about winning the war. The real war. The one that comes after the shooting stops." He walked back to the map of Okinawa and pointed at the southern tip. "We are preparing for Operation Downfall, the invasion of mainland Japan. President Truman is demanding it. General MacArthur is planning it. And Imperial General Headquarters is preparing to sacrifice every man, woman, and child in Japan to stop us. They believe we are devils. They believe death is preferable to our occupation." Hayes turned back to me, holding up the shrapnel again. "This is a piece of a U.S. Navy 5-inch shell. Our propaganda tells these people we're here to liberate them, to bring them democracy and freedom. Our shells tell them we're here to kill them. Both messages are true, Sullivan. That's the hell of it. We are their liberators and their destroyers, and they don't know which to believe." He walked toward me again, holding the shrapnel in front of my face. "That girl, Yuki Shimura. If she had died of a septic infection from an American-made wound after we had processed her, after we had shaved her head and humiliated her, what do you think that story does? Do you think it stays in this camp?" I didn't answer. I didn't know what he wanted me to say. "It spreads," Hayes said, his voice intense. "It spreads through this camp like typhus. It jumps to the other camps. It gets whispered to the locals who are still in hiding. It reaches the mainland before we do. And it confirms every single lie the Imperial Army told them about us. It proves we are the monsters they said we are." Hayes paused, letting that sink in. "It's not one dead girl, Sullivan. It's 1,000 more civilians jumping off cliffs when we invade Kyushu. It's 10,000 more GIs dead on beaches because the local population would rather fight to the death than surrender to the butchers. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" I felt like I'd been hit in the chest. I hadn't been just saving a girl. I'd been fighting a different war. A war against propaganda. A war against the lies that turned human beings into weapons against themselves. "You didn't follow the rules," Private Hayes said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. But you accidentally followed the mission. You stopped a rumor that could have cost me this entire camp. You proved their propaganda wrong. You showed them that Americans, even when we wound them, even when we capture them, even when we humiliate them with delousing, we still try to save them when they're dying. You proved we're not the monsters. He tossed the shrapnel back into the kidney dish, where it clattered. But I can't have a thief in my supply chain. Corporal Kozlowski's official statement says he misplaced an ampule during a supply transfer. A tragic punishable error. He'll be on latrine duty for a month, cleaning out the dysentery ward waste pits with a bucket and a shovel. I blinked, processing what Hayes was saying. He'd just saved Kozlowski from a court-martial by creating a cover story, by taking the theft and turning it into an accounting error. And I can't have a guard who plays favorites. Hayes continued, "You're off patrol, effective immediately. You will not stand watch. You will not carry a rifle on duty in this camp." My heart sank. This was it. The punishment, demotion, reassignment, probably to the worst detail in the camp. "You will report to Lieutenant Hoffman at 0700 hours, Hayes said. "You are now her personal orderly. You will haul water for the medical tent. You will burn excrement from the dysentery ward. You will hold down patients during treatment. You will clean wounds. You will wrap bodies when they die. You will do whatever Lieutenant Hoffman tells you to do, whenever she tells you to do it, for as long as I decide you need to do it." He stepped close to me, his eyes hard. "You will not have a rifle, Sullivan. You will have a bucket and a mop. You will save all of them, not just the one who makes you feel good about yourself, not just the one whose suffering you feel personally responsible for. All of them, every last civilian in this camp who needs help. You will prove every single day that we are not the monsters they think we are. Is that clear?" "Sir, yes, sir," I said, relief and shame washing over me in equal measure. "Get out of my sight," Hayes said. I turned to leave, my mind reeling. I was being punished, but I wasn't being destroyed. I was being reassigned to exactly where I needed to be to fix what I'd broken. Sullivan, Hayes called as I reached the tent flap. I stopped, turned back. "That's shrapnel," he said, nodding at the kidney dish. "Keep it. Remind yourself every day what happens when we forget that our weapons don't distinguish between soldiers and civilians. Our job now is to prove we're better than our weapons." "Sir." "Yes, sir," I said quietly. I walked out into the morning light, no longer a guard, no longer a soldier in the traditional sense. I was something new, something I didn't have a name for yet. But as I walked toward the medical tent, where Lieutenant Hoffman was already working where Yuki Shimura lay, recovering from a wound we had inflicted, I understood what Captain Hayes had done. He'd turned my crime into a mission, and he'd turned me into exactly the kind of soldier this new war needed. If you served in the Pacific, or if your father told you stories about the occupation of Japan, you might recognize this moment. The moment when we stopped being conquerors and started being something better, something harder. We had to prove to people who hated us, who feared us, who had been taught we were demons, that we were capable of mercy, that we could wound and heal with the same hands. Drop a comment if you remember those stories. Because what happened in the months after my reassignment, the slow transformation of that camp, from a place of fear to something approaching hope, that's a story that doesn't get told enough. That's the part of the greatest generation that we sometimes forget. We didn't just win the war, we won the peace, and that was harder. From Lieutenant Clara Hoffman's diary, July 15th, 1945. "The war has changed for me and for Private Sullivan. He's not a soldier anymore in any traditional sense. He's my arms and legs. He's become a pariah to the other GIs. They call him the Emperor's orderly. They mock him when he walks past carrying water buckets or medical supplies. But he doesn't seem to care. He works 18 hours a day. He's learned to say it doesn't hurt in Japanese. He's learned basic medical terms. Itai for pain, daijubu for it's okay, gaman for endure. He's learned to see the human being behind the shaved head in the empty stare. The camp is still a nightmare of dysentery and malnutrition. We're still fighting diseases that shouldn't exist in the modern world. But we're holding the line. We're keeping people alive. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, something is changing. The prisoners are starting to trust us. Not all of them, not even most of them, but some. And Yuki Shimura is the reason. She is the living proof that the propaganda lied. She's weak still, barely able to stand for more than a few minutes. But she started helping in the tent almost as soon as she could walk, translating for us, calming the other women when they're terrified of treatment, teaching them that the sea rations aren't poison, that the processed cheese is actually food, that the chocolate bars don't need to be boiled. She and Sullivan have developed a language that isn't English or Japanese. It's something else, a language of nods and gestures, the passing of a clean bandage, the steadying of a patient who's about to faint. A shared look when someone we thought would die makes it through the night. They don't speak to each other much. They don't need to. They understand something that most of us are still learning, that mercy is a language all its own. I watched this transformation happen over the weeks that followed. I became a ghost in the camp, invisible in my work, visible only when someone needed help. The other Marines avoided me. I ate alone. I slept alone. In a corner of the medical tent supply area, I had become something other. Not quite American, not quite Japanese, something in between. But I was useful, and in a place like Tengen, usefulness mattered more than belonging. There was an older woman, Keiko Nakamura, who had an infected foot. Gangrene was setting in. She refused treatment because she believed we were going to amputate her leg and then let her die like a dog. That's what the propaganda had taught her. That's what she expected. Yuki translated Mrs. Nakamura's fear to Lieutenant Hoffman. Clara was frustrated. "We're trying to save her leg, not take it," she said. "How do we make her understand that I knelt beside Mrs. Nakamura in the mud?" I had Yuki translate for me, slowly, carefully. I showed Mrs. Nakamura the sulfur powder we would use, the clean bandages, the gentle way we would clean the wound. "No cut," I said through Yuki. "Just clean, just medicine. Make better." Mrs. Nakamura looked at my face for a long time, searching for the demon she'd been promised, looking for the cruelty that propaganda had guaranteed. Then she looked at Yuki, who nodded. "Trust him," Yuki said in Japanese. "He saved me. He'll save you too." Mrs. Nakamura allowed the treatment. Over the next 2 weeks, with careful cleaning and sulfur powder applications, the infection receded. She kept her leg, and she became the second voice in the camp, speaking a new truth. The Americans are not what we were told. More women started coming forward. A young mother with a sick infant. An elderly man with dysentery so severe he should have died days ago. A teenage girl with an infected wound from shrapnel. Not American shrapnel this time, Japanese. From their own people's desperate last defense. Each one I helped treat, I thought about the piece of American shrapnel I kept in my footlocker. The one from Yuki's body. Captain Hayes had told me to keep it as a reminder. And I did. Every night I looked at it and thought about what it meant. We could be the weapon that hurts, or we could be the hand that heals. The choice was ours. The final week of July was hot and breathless. The monsoons had passed, leaving behind a heavy, oppressive heat that made everything harder. I was emptying a waste bucket near the medical tent when I saw Yuki sitting outside taking a break from translating. Her hair had started to grow back, a soft, dark fuzz that made her look younger, more vulnerable, but also somehow more alive. She watched me work. I was filthy, covered in mud, and worse things, carrying a bucket of human waste to the burn pit. This was what I'd been reduced to. This was my war now. Not killing, cleaning, not destroying, healing. I stopped awkward, still holding the foul-smelling bucket. The cultural chasm was still there. I was a man unmarried. She was a woman unmarried. I was American. She was Japanese. I was the enemy who had saved her. She was the enemy I had learned to see as human. I nodded. "Ma'am," I said, using the only respectful form of address I could think of. She nodded back, and then she did something that stopped me cold. She put her hand to her side where the wound had been, where we had cut her open, and pulled out a piece of American steel. The wound had healed now, leaving a scar that she would carry for the rest of her life, a reminder of what we had done and what we had fixed. Then she put her hand to my arm. Just for a second, just long enough for the touch to register. A light, impossible touch that violated every rule of her culture and mine. She was reenacting the moment from that midnight encounter. When she had gasped, "Please touch here." When she had grabbed my hand and forced it to the infected mass that was killing her. That first touch had been a plea born of agony, so profound it shattered all custom. It had been the desperate cry of a human being in pain reaching for any other human being who might help, enemy or not. This second touch was not a plea. It was a statement, a completion of the circle. You touched this, the gesture said. You saved this, and I am grateful. She bowed her head. Arigatou gozaimasu, she said softly. Thank you very much. The formal version, the one that carried weight and respect. I felt something break in my chest. The knot I'd been carrying since the day I watched her hair fall into the mud, since the day I'd held her down while she screamed thinking we were going to kill her, finally loosened. I couldn't speak. My throat was too tight. I just nodded and carried the bucket away. Some thank yous are too big for words. Some moments of connection can't be explained or defended or justified in any official report. They just are. Two human beings from opposite sides of a war, acknowledging each other's humanity in a way that transcended language and law and propaganda. I heard the news on August 6th. The word spread through the camp like wildfire. A new weapon, a single bomb. An entire city, Hiroshima, gone in a flash of light brighter than 1,000 suns. The rumor seemed impossible, insane, but it kept coming. More details, more confirmation. Then August 9th, Nagasaki, another city, another impossible weapon. And then on August 15th, the voice we never thought we'd hear. The Emperor of Japan on the radio, his voice thin and crackling and barely audible over the static, speaking in formal classical Japanese that many of the prisoners could barely understand. But the message was clear enough. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. The unthinkable had happened. The camp erupted in chaos. The Japanese prisoners were stunned into silence. Some wept. Some went catatonic. Their god emperor had admitted defeat. The world had ended. Everything they believed, everything they'd been taught, everything they'd suffered for, had been for nothing. The American GIs were celebrating, shooting flares into the air, getting drunk on whatever alcohol they could find, screaming with joy. We're going home. We don't have to invade. We're going home. I stood in the middle of it all, feeling disconnected from both reactions. I was going home, eventually. But what did home even mean now? How did you go back to Brooklyn and work in your uncle's grocery store after this? After watching families jump off cliffs, after stealing medicine to save an enemy, after learning that the line between human and monster was thinner than anyone wanted to admit, I looked for her in the chaos. I saw her by the medical tent standing with Mrs. Nakamura and a small group of other women. They were watching the American celebrations with wide, uncertain eyes. What happened to them now? Would they be sent home to what their cities were rubble? Their families were scattered or dead. Home didn't exist anymore for them either. I was on a truck 3 days later, part of the first group being rotated out. The war was over, but someone still had to guard the camps until the formal occupation structure was in place. That someone wasn't going to be me. I'd been in combat for 2 months. I'd earned rotation home. I looked for Yuki one last time as the truck loaded. I saw her by the medical tent watching the trucks leave. Other prisoners were watching too, uncertain about their futures, about what came next in this strange new world where the war was over, but nothing was resolved. Our eyes met across the yard, 100 yards of mud and history between us. I couldn't go to her. She couldn't come to me. The rules were still the rules, even if the war was over. Maybe especially because the war was over. She watched me, her face unreadable. And then slowly, deliberately, she bowed. It was a deep, formal bow. Not the bow of submission, not the bow of a prisoner to a captor. It was the bow of profound, equal respect. The bow you give to someone who has changed your life, who has saved your life, who has proved that everything you were taught about them was a lie. I felt my throat close up. I raised my hand in a clumsy, awkward wave. It was all I could do, all I was allowed to do. The truck rumbled forward and she disappeared behind the canvas and the fencing and the ruins of Okinawa. As the truck bounced down the road toward the harbor, I reached into my pocket and found something I hadn't put there. A small, folded piece of rice paper. Someone must have slipped it to me during the loading. Maybe one of the children who were always running around the trucks, maybe someone else. I opened it carefully. It was a charcoal sketch done with the burnt stick on rough paper. It wasn't a portrait of my face, it was a drawing of my hands. Large, rough hands with dirt under the fingernails. Soldier's hands, holding a small photograph, carefully, gently picking it out of the mud. The moment when the devil started to become a man, the moment when the enemy started to become human. I clutched that piece of paper as the truck headed for the harbor and the ship that would take me back to the world. It was the only proof I had that any of it had meant anything, that in an ocean of propaganda and hate and institutional cruelty, two people had managed to see each other as human beings. That mercy was possible, even when everything screamed it shouldn't be. 60 years later, I'm an old man. I'm 79 years old, living in a small apartment in Brooklyn, not far from where I grew up. My granddaughter Sophie, she's 12, comes to visit me on weekends. She's a good kid, curious, always asking questions. Grandpa, she said last Saturday, looking at the wall of my study, "Who drew this?" "It's really good." The charcoal sketch was framed now, preserved behind glass, still visible after all these years. The hands, the photograph, the moment of mercy in the mud. "A girl I knew in the war," I said. "A girl I was supposed to hate." Sophie looked at me with those big, curious eyes. "Did you hate her?" I was quiet for a long moment, looking at my own hands now. Old hands, liver spotted, shaking slightly from age and too much coffee, but still recognizable as the hands in that drawing. "I thought I was supposed to," I said finally. "They told us she was the enemy, that her people were different from us, that they didn't value life the way we did, that they were willing to die rather than surrender to us because we were monsters to them." Sophie waited. She was good at waiting and knowing when there was more to a story. But when someone asks you to save them, I said they stop being the enemy. They become just someone who needs help. And if you can help, if you have the medicine or the skill or just the willingness to try, then you have to make a choice. You can follow the rules and let them die. Or you can break the rules and maybe save them. And you have to live with whichever choice you make. "What did you choose?" Sophie asked. "I chose to save her," I said, "and it almost destroyed my career. I stole medicine that was reserved for American soldiers. I gave it to an enemy, and I'd do it again, every time. Because the alternative, letting her die from a wound we inflicted, that would have destroyed something more important than my career. It would have destroyed the part of me that was still human." "Did you ever see her again?" Sophie asked. After the war, I shook my head. "No, the war ended. We all went home. She went to whatever was left of hers. I came back to Brooklyn." "Do you think she remembered you?" I looked at the sketch on the wall. "She drew this," I said. "So, yes, I think she remembered." Sophie was quiet, processing. Then she asked the question I'd been waiting for. "What did you learn, Grandpa?" From the war, I took a deep breath. I learned that sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do isn't killing the enemy. It's refusing to see them as one. I learned that we can be the weapon that hurts, or we can be the hand that heals. And we get to choose. Every day in 1,000 small ways, we get to choose what kind of people we are. I pointed to the sketch. "Those hands," I said, "they're my hands. Young and strong and dirty from war. And they're picking up somebody's family photo out of the mud. That's what I want to remember. Not the people I killed, not the battles I fought, but that moment when I chose to be kind to someone I was supposed to hate. That moment when I saw past the uniform and the propaganda and the fear and just saw another human being who needed help." Sophie looked at the sketch for a long time. Then she hugged me. "You were a good soldier, Grandpa." "No," I said, hugging her back. "I was a terrible soldier. I broke the rules. I stole. I disobeyed orders. But maybe, just maybe, I was a good human being. And in the end, I think that matters more." Next to the framed sketch on my shelf, there's a small wooden box. Inside that box is a piece of metal. A jagged 2-inch triangle of black pitted steel with U.S. Navy markings etched into its side. The piece of shrapnel we pulled from Yuki Shimura's body in a canvas tent on Okinawa in the summer of 1945. I keep it as a reminder. The shrapnel was American. The wound was American. But the cure was American too. We built the weapons that destroyed. But we also had the medicine that healed. We had the choice. We have always had the choice. If this story moved you, I want you to do something. Share it with someone who served. Share it with someone who needs to remember that even in humanity's darkest hours, even when we're at our worst, we still have the capacity for mercy. We still have the choice to see the human being on the other side of the propaganda. That's what makes us American. Not the weapons we build, not the wars we win, but the moments when we choose to heal instead of hurt, when we choose to see instead of hate, when we choose to be better than our worst impulses. The greatest generation, we're called, the generation that saved the world. But we didn't save it with guns and bombs alone. We saved it with moments like this. Moments when a Brooklyn kid and a girl from Shuri saw past the propaganda and the fear and the hate and recognized each other as human. That's the war we really won. Not the one against Japan or Germany, but the war against the idea that some people are less human than others. The war against the propaganda that turns neighbors into enemies and civilians into acceptable casualties. We won that war one person at a time, one act of mercy at a time, one stolen ampule of penicillin at a time. And 60 years later, I'm still winning it. Every time I tell this story, every time someone listens and understands that the line between enemy and human is a choice we make, not a fact of nature. So I'm asking you, choose to see, choose to heal. Choose to be the hand that saves, not the weapon that destroys. Because in the end, that's the only choice that matters. And it's a choice we make every single day and in ways large and small until the day we die. I made my choice in the mud of Okinawa in 1945, and I've never regretted it. Not once, not ever.